Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding for hosting this event. I'm Hadia Mubarak. I'll be the moderator for the event. I'm a fifth-year doctoral student here at Georgetown University, actually, in the Islamic Studies department. And I'm happy to be one of the contributors to this book. There are 40 contributors to this book, actually. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it or look through it. All 40 women are born and raised in the United States, and they're all Muslim American from very diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, and different wide spectrum of religious practices as well, and who are all Muslim. So I think you'll find it very interesting. And we have one panelist running late, and she'll be here very, very shortly, hopefully. As we observed the 10th anniversary of 9/11 just 10 days ago, I thought it would be most appropriate to begin with our memories of that day and its impact on shaping our identity as Muslim Americans. The horrific images I witnessed on the morning of 9/11 10 years ago, sitting among a large circle of students at Florida State University as planes crashed through one of the greatest economic symbols of our nation, pierced my mind as if it just happened yesterday. I can still conjure to memory every moment of that chaotic day, every emotion that penetrated my being, and every thought that swam through my consciousness, as if I was in a state of paralysis, as if logic and reason were only products of our imagination. Until now, 10 years later, there are no reasonable explanations, no data analysis that can be nicely charted into graphs, no words of comfort that can restore the naivety, innocence, and sense of security that my generation lost that day. It was also the first time, however, that I realized my own displacement as an American Muslim in the American public consciousness. Before I was allowed to shed my tears, to grieve for the thousands of innocent lives, or to try to make sense out of the absurd violence that shook our lives, I was put on the defense seat as American Muslims became the target of vandalism, became the target of hate crimes, discrimination, and irresponsible media coverage that associated Islam with terrorism. Those days, as a junior at Florida State University and an officer of the Muslim Students Association, were some of the most testing in my life, as my beliefs were questioned, my religion was misunderstood, and my identity as an American Muslim undermined. Although I was born and raised in this country and knew no other place to call home, I and other Muslim Americans came to realize for the first time that we were not in fact perceived as American in the eyes of a large swath of the general public. As our religious beliefs became a reason for our incrimination after 9/11 and places of worship became the target of vandalism and hate crimes, and as we were perceived as potential threats to the security of our own nation, we felt that our very identity as Americans was subjected to scrutiny, challenge, and suspicion. The struggle to legitimize our identity as Muslim Americans has existed for decades prior to 9/11, however. One common theme you will find among the 40 contributors of this book, the 40 Muslim women who were born and raised in America, is that despite our very diverse backgrounds, we have all had to justify our Americanness in one way or another. For each one of us, there was something about our appearance, maybe our tan skin, our headscarf, our name, or our religious practices that made us appear as the other in the eyes of our peers and colleagues. The catalyst behind this book is to allow Muslim American women to stand up and speak for themselves, to seize the narrative from those seeking to distort Islam, whether they be right-wing xenophobic bigots, to be frank, or Muslim extremists who use religion to justify violence and repression. What we realized after 9/11 is that unless we mainstream Muslims stand up and speak for ourselves, then others will continue to speak on our behalf. I speak for myself. American Women on Being Muslim presents a kaleidoscope of stories woven together around the central idea of limitlessness and individuality. A common theme linking these intimate self-portraits is the way each woman uniquely defies labeling, simply by defining for herself what it means to be American and Muslim and female. Today, I'm very pleased to have with us three of the panelists, three of the contributors, and one of them is on her way from New Jersey, I believe, or Pennsylvania, right? And so we'll start with Asma Uddin. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of altmuslima.com. She is also an international law attorney with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, a public interest law firm based in Washington, D.C. Her writing has appeared in Muslim Girl magazine, Islamica magazine, Al-Muslim, BeliefNet, and in The Guardian's Comment is Free. She is also an expert panelist for the Washington Post, Newsweek blog On Faith, and a contributor to Huffington Post Religion, CNN's Belief blog, and Common Ground News. Her more scholarly work has been published in the Rutgers Journal of Law and Religion, the Review of Faith and International Affairs, and the St. Thomas University Law Journal. Asma has traveled throughout Europe and to various Muslim countries to meet with Muslim and other minority groups, as well as politicians, journalists, and anti-discrimination organizations. She's a 2005 graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, where she was a member of the University of Chicago Law Review.
Great, thank you, Hadia. And I think that, I'm going to kind of piggyback on some of the comments that you made about this idea of taking control of our narrative, especially in the post 9/11 landscape. And I think a lot of what you focused on was the idea of taking control from those outside the community. But a lot of what motivated me to write for this book, and that I actually touch upon in this book, is the idea of taking control of it within the community as well. This idea that so many certain segments of the community sort of lay out our experience of Islam, and sometimes it's really about sort of taking back control and negotiating that experience for ourselves. And so much of what I cover in my piece is this idea of my experience growing up Muslim in America was really a gendered experience. It was very different because I was a female, and so my experiences are very different, not just as a female, but somebody who was born and raised in the U.S., who grew up with very sort of strong notions of what it meant to be a woman and to be equal with equal dignity and rights with men, and how I really kind of negotiated that with a lot of the things that I was sort of encountering within the community, not just the sort of sound bites that we get hit with by the media in terms of Muslim women as somehow silent and oppressed and spoken for by others, the sort of stereotype all Muslim women as silent and submissive and all Muslim men as violent and aggressive. That was already enough to cause plenty of turmoil, but then to have to encounter at an early point in my life the sort of internal sort of I guess reflections of that internal into the community was really pretty complex. And so before I kind of move on to that story, I just wanted to note that in addition to motivating my contribution to this book, it also motivated my starting a website. It's an online magazine, as Hadia mentioned. It's called altmuslima.com. And it's a site that I started about 2.5 years ago, and it deals with the question of gender in Islam. And we cover the wide gamut of what I consider the mainstream Muslim American position on that. So you're not going to see the extreme left, you're not going to see the extreme right, but you are going to see all that exists in between, and there's quite a lot of diversity. Alt Muslima, it's A-L-T, Muslim, A-H. Muslima is a female Muslim, but the site is not limited to female contributors or female readers. It was just, our partner site was Alt Muslim, and so to differentiate ourselves, we call it Alt Muslima. And it's really sort of a co-ed perspective, men and women speaking about gender issues broadly in Islam. It's interesting, in the 2.5 years since I've launched it, it's just I've had the privilege of speaking to so many different audiences about the work there. And what's really kind of coming to the fore is the fact that so many Muslim Americans here like connect with it so deeply, because for the first time they see a platform that kind of expresses our diversity and internal sort of nuance and complexity of our experiences. Something finally that's sort of authentic to being a devout Muslim, while at the same time negotiating that faith in our lived reality. And so what is that story? It's not a story as dramatic as some of the other people you might be hearing in the news, like Ayaan Hirsi and stories of female genital mutilations and things like that. But it is something that's quite deep. It started, in high school. High school was a culmination of my sort of wonderful, peaceful relationship with Islam and religion generally. This idea that religion could do no wrong. And that Islam specifically was just like this amazing religion. I just couldn't see anything about it that wasn't uplifting and amazing. That soon was going to come to an end. Upon entering college, I started to encounter variable interpretations of a religion that I thought was simple and easy and beautiful, which it is. But what I sort of was focusing so much on the normative message and not so much in terms of the many ways that people experience it. And so my encounter with the complexity of Islam happened in college when I was met with a lot of foreign students, mostly Saudi male students that had sort of converged on our school's engineering program. And there began this sort of encounter in the Muslim circles where these men they didn't really have the same idea of Islam as I did. Their conception of Islam was one in which women were to be excluded, were to speak from the other side of the curtain, were to not take leadership roles, and were at all times supposed to look the same and dress the same. And if not, their Muslimness was questioned. Simultaneous, and these same Muslims actually also control the prayer room in our university campus and populated it with a number of books that I can now say sort of espouse what we call Wahhabi ideology. And not to paint every Wahhabi with the same sort of like brushstroke, but it was quite troubling. A number of these books were titled something along the lines of How to Become the Ideal Muslimah. And upon, with my eagerness to learn more in terms of like wanting to be the best Muslim I can, I approached this from a place of sincerity and purity, only to find that the story after story within these books was about how becoming the best Muslim female I can be required that I subjugate myself to Muslim men. That it was a story of attaining heaven only through, serving men and facilitating their spiritual fulfillment. And there was, of course, something very troubling about this. For somebody who grew up as sort of a staunch feminist in the Muslim American framework, somebody who grew up quite devout, to her religion, and to all of a sudden see that the same religion was being defined in such problematic terms. And of course, at that initial stage, I didn't really have the initial sort of gut instinct to distinguish an interpretation from the religion itself. I figured, hey, if they're supporting a scriptural text, this must be the right interpretation, or a sort of viable interpretation. Of course, though, what occurred after that was just several years of intense sort of spiritual agony, kind of just reflecting on these texts, reflecting on some of the women that were married to these men, that were somehow connected to these men, and it really kind of led me to a place where I was like, wait a second, this is causing a lot of sort of conflict within myself. Here I am a devout Muslim on the one hand, but I'm also a staunch believer in female rights, and somehow these people are telling me those two things don't exactly fit. And so I experienced an extreme case of cognitive dissonance that I have to say almost took me to the point of unbelief, of just losing belief and losing faith. But luckily enough, I was able to step back from that. And so here I'll pause and say that this wasn't purely an academic sort of conflict. It wasn't something just like reading books and observing from afar. But it was also just the stuff that I saw happening among people I knew on the campus and among my own family. In fact, my grandfather, who was from Pakistan and lived in Pakistan, was actually in a polygamous marriage. And my grandmother was his first wife. He took a second wife soon after, and she managed to survive that. But around that time, he also took on a third, much younger wife. And I saw the impact that it was having on my grandmother. One of my own uncles in Miami, one of my step-uncles, did something very similar where he took on a much younger second wife, but unfortunately that marriage is essentially what he called a marriage, was nothing more than a series of weekend trips to a Floridian island. And it was beginning to really trouble me, this idea that there are men, so it's not just something I read in books, but there are men that are implementing these interpretations in ways that are essentially destroying women. My grandmother developed Parkinson's, became very quiet and depressed, and died soon after. And my aunt, who herself was a convert, actually, a Nicaraguan convert who had married my uncle, called me incessantly to sort of share her turmoil with the experiences she was going through with her husband doing this. And so, again, this was something that was really hitting home for me. But there was a point, though, at which I just felt that I had to put away the social commentary. I had to put away the experiences of these other people who are suffering at the hands of people who did interpret religion in this problematic way. And it was a moment of sort of realization where I just sort of put it all away and decided to think sort of deeply about what is religion, and about the notions of fitra in Islam, and this idea of our original disposition of all people as good and all people as equal. And it was just like a very simple sort of total faith moment away from all the chaos on the outside that brought me this amazing, intense sort of clarity. And from there, I was able to kind of and there I was able to, subsequent years, I encountered a number of different, more positives or more nuanced, more scholars who spoke to my specific American Muslim experience. And so I'm going to read an excerpt from my essay that kind of talks about this. It took years for me to achieve any semblance of peace, which came largely through long periods of observation and contemplation of what I later discovered to be God's signs. He was initiating dialogue, and through time, I came to embrace that interaction. As I continued to read, I encountered a wide variety of books about spiritual purification and other issues beyond extremist rhetoric. I questioned the reasons behind my feminist bent. Following hours of meditation and eventually greater self-realization, I learned to better distinguish between environmental and instinctual sources of my ethics. And more importantly, I discovered an Islam that was welcoming, similar to my high school Islam, but far richer, more complex than any Islam I had before encountered. For me, the intricacies of Islamic legal interpretation, the depth of Islamic spirituality, and the breadth of Islam's acceptance of variable practices forever disproved the extremist version. Whereas before I had always feared subjectivity and variability in religion, mistaking these characteristics as somehow being antithetical to absolute truth, what I learned from my studies of Islamic law and legal interpretation is that subjectivity actually underscores religious authenticity. If Islam, aside from its essential core, is about interpretational diversity, allowing room for people's cultures and personalities to determine what is religiously right or possible for them, then there is a greater likelihood that Islam is a true religion. After all, truth must be accessible to all, and universal accessibility is impossible with black and white interpretations that place most of the world outside the parameters of proper Islam. And it was precisely this that I learned from my religion. Islam is, at its core, a religion of dissent. It is not premised on an endless list of do's and don'ts, but is instead multifarious and openly accepting of multiplicity.
Can you please pull the pages?
That's pages 40 and 41. And so I'll end it there, and I just, I want to say that, to sort of circle back to your original point about our post 9/11 condition, it's really about accepting the fact that Muslims are non-monolithic, and that what this book actually tells us and shows us is that each of our experiences are so nuanced and complex. And the more we can kind of bring out the complexity of those experiences and share those stories, it allows us to take control of our narrative both within and outside the community. Thank you.
We'll start now with we'll move to our second panelist, Talika Khan, who just joined us from Philadelphia.
Yeah, I have to apologize. I was stuck in traffic and a mad cab driver, so I know that all works out. In any case, yeah.
Read your bio, sorry.
That's
I don't
fine.
just
It's kind of vague, so I'll fill you guys in.
Saliqa Khan is a digital journalist working with the leading internet news company. During her professional tenure, she broke and covered some of the nation's most gripping news stories and continues to seek new and innovative ways to tell a compelling story with multimedia panache. Saliqa also works closely with Grammy Award-nominated artists and producers in the music industry on several independent projects. She expresses herself through poetry and spoken word. She is a rebel at heart who enjoys walking the thin line and occasionally crossing it to bring awareness to injustices that surround her. She is a firm believer that the pen is mightier than the sword. As a priority, she strives to make sure she is always giving back in some form, starting with family first and continuing with those in need. Saliqa feels blessed with the wisdom to see the silver lining in almost any negative situation. She truly believes that God knows best. For more information on Saliqa and her work, check her website, www.saliqa.com.
Thank you. Thank you, Hadia. It's a pleasure to be here. I wrote that bio when I was transitioning from employment from one company, I was with NBC at the time, to now AOL. So that explains kind of the, the vague description there. So just to kind of give you more of a background, I still work in the news business. Are any of you familiar with Patch.com? Okay, well, it's an online news website. So the reason I'm talking about that is because a lot of what I wrote in the book is a very personal story, but it's kind of come to merge my professional and my personal life with what I do on a daily basis, which is write and tell stories. And I wrote this story and it was not a problem. What was the issue for me was the hesitation in submitting it, because now it's out there for everybody to read, and it's a very, very personal story for me. So I'm not going to read an excerpt from the book just because it's something that's difficult for me, and I would prefer you just read it at your leisure. So I will discuss it, though. I got a phone call from Maria through, we knew a mutual friend. She's one of the editors of the book, and she had asked me if I would be interested in submitting an essay for the book. And at the time, I was working at CBS, and it was kind of a transition period for me. I was married for almost 10 years, and I was going through a divorce. And so for me, the immediate thing I thought of was my Islam, my connection really was through the most difficult time in my life. I just was looking for something to hold on to and kind of navigate me through these tough waters. And it just kind of all came together, and that's what I talk about in the book. I talk about my experiences with that final break, if you will. In terms of my personal story, it's my parents immigrated here from Pakistan, and my father's side is Afghani. So I grew up as a first-generation American, and there was always that expectation, being the woman, that you just follow what kind of outlined for you, and including career tracks. So if I wasn't an engineer or doctor, I wasn't successful. So I chose to become a journalist, and I got written off by my parents for that until I got my first actual real job, if you will. And in doing so also, I've always kind of gravitated towards things that I'm not, I guess, the abnormal, or just the other side, and just trying to, merge worlds together, because for me, we grew up American, but we were trying to be infused with this identity of where my parents were from, and trying to merge those two worlds together was really difficult for me. So I really found Islam, like I said, in my marriage, at the end of my marriage, if you will. It was a really rough time, and I was trying to kind of just put my finger on what I was supposed to do. And, there's just, sometimes, it's almost like a spinning compass where you're like, what direction am I supposed to go in? And I was still in college, I was still pursuing my degree, and I found that, the more I just kind of let myself go in terms of prayer and what I needed to do, I just felt almost kind of a sense of freedom. My ex-husband is Puerto Rican, and that was already kind of a big, I guess, issue within the culture in our community. And I don't know if any of you are Pakistani or Afghani, but there's the expectation you'll marry even within your own cultural and ethnic group. Particularly someone from your village or from the area you're from. So that was already kind of, butting heads with my own family and his family as well. And a lot of people thought that we got married because we met and then he reverted, but he had already been a revert Muslim, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's somebody who embraces Islam. So I kind of already dealt with these issues, and then it just kind of compounded with some other issues I had going on. So long story short, in terms of what I wrote, it was a cathartic experience for me. It was something I needed to tell, because there's this kind of expectation in Islam, or from what I gather from people, when they hear that I'm divorced and that I'm a working woman and I have 3 children and I'm still doing all the things I can do, it's almost like, they gasp and they're like, wow, like, you can get a divorce in Islam. And that was, I think now there's more knowledge about it, and there's more, people understand that Islam gives you that opportunity. And it was never a situation, once I got educated on what my rights were, I loved Islam even more, because I felt like, wow, I'm empowered as a woman, not only because I have these rights, but because it's written and it's here for me to expose and to take action on. So a lot of that was just affirmation. The more I got to learn about Islam and just what I was doing on a day-to-day, and how it kind of correlated with the track and the decision that I made to finally get that divorce. And in subsequent months and years even, it's almost been the healing for me as well. So I'll just kind of talk about the some of the things that I noticed. While I was married, my last name was Santiago. So at that time, it was more like I was accepted, you know. Even within the news industry, I got more. I would say that I got more response in terms of when I would pitch stories or when I would promote certain things. And I noticed it was actually while we were moving from one building to another building in Philly at CBS that they asked everybody what their name, like on your name tag, if you'd like your first and middle initial and your last name or the whole name. And so I said, well, I want my my maiden name, because they had mistakenly put on Santiago, and I had just gotten my name changed back. So for me, it was a big pride issue, because Khan means leader. And I like to think of myself that way. So I wanted my name back. I wanted all the work that I put into whatever I was going to put out there for the public to be mine. And I just remember people saying, but why would you want that name? You know, why do you want, I said, that's my name. You know, I want it there. That's the name that I want. So just to kind of translate that to September 11th, I had no problems flying ever until I switched my name back to Khan. And suddenly it was like I was always stopped, and you know, so I switched my name back about probably 2 years after I got divorced. It took quite a while to get that done. But in those 2 years, I flew frequently for work. And so kind of what I noticed is I was on both sides of the coin. It was like, well, okay, I see how different it is when you've got this name. And then, you know, because people would say, oh, you look kind of Spanish. And I'm like, no, I think I look like me, you know? And people would say, okay, you can pass for that. But when I switched back to Khan, that's when I really got the, you know, the other side. And I thought, wow. And talking about September 11th, it was kind of an interesting time just for my family in general. My father was in the U.S. Army for 25 years, so I grew up in a military culture. We grew up all over the country, overseas. So when the events actually came about and they happened, I just remember being in Colorado Springs, and I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that city, but it's heavily military. There's 4 bases that kind of surround the city, and we lived closer to the Air Force Academy. So for our military community, we're really tight-knit. They were like, are you guys okay? Nobody's giving you any problems? And we're like, we're fine. But I noticed once we took ourselves outside of our kind of community, which we grew up in the military, it just kind of, you know, I did get some of that pushback, if you will. And I understand there was that initial hesitation, and there was kind of like, okay, they're over there on the defensive, and that wasn't the case. And I kind of that I've always been into journalism. It's always been a passion of mine, but this is how I found to bridge the gap. And one part is the book, talking about my personal experience. The other part is what I do on a day-to-day. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, so feel free to let me know. But in talking about
2 minutes.
Okay, talking about that, one thing I encourage Muslims and just people at the mosque and just people in general is, if you want your story told, half of the responsibility lies in you informing somebody. You know, I work in a management capacity where I'm getting news releases left and right, and if I don't know about it, I can't report on it or write about it. And yes, it's my obligation to seek out stories, but how many stories can we tell? And there are some really great, enriching stories from the ethnic community and within Islam that never get told because we're too busy trying to defend what's out there. And I think oftentimes that the message really should be, let's be proactive about the approach. Let's talk about what we're doing that's positive. I have one community member from Philly who reached out to me and said, we're having a charity day where we're going to be feeding and giving away clothes to the homeless and clothing them and putting shoes on their feet and just feeding them for the day and trying to give them the basic necessities. And I thought, this is what I'm talking about. Because at the end of the day, if you're not presenting your story, in a sense, you're giving someone else permission to do it for you. And you trying to retroactively repair that, or retroactively just kind of give them all the information they need, they've already kind of set their perception in a way based on what they're already getting from around them. And I can tell you, in the newsroom, in all the newsrooms I've been in, I have been the only Muslim woman there, whether it's on the technical side or in the production side or just post-production. I've been the only woman of Asian descent from Pakistan, Afghanistan region. So for me, as soon as they would find that out, they'd be like, whoa, you're not like them. So there's always that constant need to just prove who you are. But I think in doing that, just to kind of go off with the pen is mightier than the sword, when you write your story, no one else can write it for you. And that's just kind of the takeaway I hope you all get is you want some positive news about Muslims. You want something that's enriching to others. It's something that we have to tell. It's our stories that we have to present.
Thank you so much, Saliqa. Our third and last panelist is Yusra Tekbali. Am I pronouncing it right? Tekbali. She's a freelance journalist and a blogger born to Libyan parents in Woodland, California. She graduated from the University of Arizona with degrees in journalism and Near Eastern Studies, and she speaks Arabic and Spanish fluently. After college, she spent some time in D.C., where she worked as a staff assistant in the U.S. House of Representatives, volunteered with the Arab American Institute, and was elected to serve as a board member of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee. She also worked in Libya for the National Youth Council, reporting on Libyan women. She blogs for Muslim Media Watch, and her work has appeared in the Tripoli Post, the Arizona Daily Star, Chicago Public Radio, the Washington Diplomat, Al Jazeera English, the Arab American News, CNN, Global Post, and IslamOnline.net. She's a certified Zumba instructor and a natural performer with a background in theater, gymnastics, cheerleading, and dance. Her blog is a collection of spoken word poems chronicling the complexities of being an Arab Muslim feminist in the modern world. She was the only Libyan selected to compete in the Miss Arab USA pageant.
All right. I just came back from the Arab world. I was there. I moved to Libya in December. And after the revolution broke out on February 17th, I panicked and we stayed for like 2 weeks. And then we left on the U.S. boat that took Americans out. It was me and my mom and my sister's husband. And we stayed in Malta. They took us to Malta. So we stayed there for 10 days. And they decided to go back to America. I had a conference. I had moved to the Arab world with the intention of living in the Arab world for a year, so I was not going to go back to the U.S. because Gaddafi was crazy and kicked me out. So I ended up just kind of going on this, like, I don't know, like this soul-searching journey around the Arab world, which wasn't the intention. It just kind of, I got very lucky. I started working for a Libyan charity, and we went to Tunisia, and we went to Cairo, and we set up and we worked with refugees, and very difficult experience. It's not easy to be a Libyan. It's not easy to be a Muslim, and it's not easy to be an Arab in this day and age. I was 16 in September 11th. I was 16 years old, and ever since then, I just became obsessed with like Arab and Muslim issues, and so I spent a lot of time in college, perhaps looking back now more than I should have, just kind of obsessing about Islam and wanting to prove everybody wrong and wanting to find an inner peace with it. It was very difficult. I think that for me, Islam has always, since that point in my life, been polluted by politics, and it still is, but with the Arab revolutions and the Arab Spring, and seeing young Muslims do this, and young Muslims fight against tyranny, and young Muslims pray in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and embrace their religion, and embrace who they are in a way that is not, I guess it just does not turn you off, in a way that's very welcoming. It really enforced my belief in Islam. So I don't think that you can separate politics and religion, in my opinion. I don't think you can. I couldn't. And so my essay deals with that, because I was one of the only few, I think I was like one of 5 Arab Muslims on Capitol Hill at the time. I was working for Representative Gabrielle Giffords, who's an amazing woman, a Jewish congresswoman. So anything that came up about interfaith, I was like glad to support and do that. But it was really difficult to work on Capitol Hill and be Muslim and be Arab, especially when you're right out of college. I worked there right after college. And so I'm going to read a small excerpt from my essay, just to sort of give you an idea of how I interpreted the environment there. So I say January was one of the loneliest and most depressing months I've spent on the Hill. I sought comfort by having lunch with a Palestinian friend who was drafting an alternative bill for Representative Dennis Kucinich. This one actually recognized the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and called on both sides to end the ceasefire. And this was after January 2009. Her resolve was inspiring, and it reaffirmed my belief in the system as a means of change. After all, I work in Congress because I believe in democracy and the American way of governance. When I walk through the halls of the Capitol building and in the footsteps of white Christian men, I'm reminded of the Declaration of Independence and the values America was founded on. I feel patriotic because I believe in those principles and justice and equality for all. America has a troubled, complicated past, the past 8 years not included, but it also has an admirable history of supporting human rights, and I'm proud to have inherited that history. When I'm roaming the Capitol Hill halls and the streets of Washington, I'm reminded of my U.S. history class in elementary school and all that I learned about our country. I'm reminded of the time I dressed up as a Native American for a school play and sang America the Beautiful. The historical significance of the Capitol reinforces what I learned in school, and working in proximity to it reminds me how America's history continues to shape my identity. Throughout my life, I've never felt like my ethnicity or religion clash with the love I have for America. Even when my family and I would visit Libya during summer vacations, I longed to return home to the familiar country where I grew up. It's not that I think America is perfect or superior to anywhere else, but the comfort of a culture that is a hybrid of many other cultures makes it too endearing to have to leave for very long. September 11th may have triggered questions about my faith, but it didn't make me question whether or not I was American. Some people notoriously disagreed, and they still do. So now looking back at that, and after having lived through these revolutions, I still feel the same way, but my definition of being a Muslim, I think, has become a lot friendlier, maybe, not friendlier, but the way that the world now views the Arab world and Arab youth especially, I think, has made it a little bit easier to come to terms with what it means to be an Arab American in this day and age. And when I was in Cairo, I met with a lot of youth activists, a lot of Arab youth activists who had no problem separating their religion from their politics, and which I found very inspiring. But also, just I think that if the media reported on Arab world and revolution, if the media reported on the Arab world and on Islam in a way that wasn't so biased, would see that we're all just human, and that basically was reinforced to me throughout the past 7 months. And so when I began blogging for Muslim Media Watch, I did so with maybe not knowing exactly why, but I was drawn to the site because it was these Muslims speaking for themselves, and Muslim women being able to sort of counter all this BS about who they are in the media, and the way that it's written. I think the way that we're described in the media has a direct effect on our daily life, which is starting to change. So I guess I would just like to end with saying that when you meet people from all around the world, it's very easy to put them into these categories because of war, because of our foreign policy, or because of all these different things. But I mean, the past 7 months have just shown me that Arabs and Muslims are able to break all types of stereotypes and are able to overcome anything. I mean, I met people who had never left Libya, who never traveled outside the Arab world, who knew more about the world than I did, and were more educated, more cultured than I was. So I think the best way, like I said, the best way to combat these things is to tell your story, and that's what drew me to this book, is women speaking for themselves and telling their story on their own terms. I think that the more we have minorities and more Muslims speaking out like that, especially Muslim women,
you know, the easier it will be for future generations. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Yusra.
Yeah.
We definitely want to leave some time for questions and answers. And it's